Well, I hope you're having a great winter. The skiing is outstanding in the east, and natural gas prices are above $4 per MMBTU, so it's been a pretty good winter. I want to do a brief video here on the assumptions on economic models, and we're going to use tariffs as an example because it's in the news quite a bit. So one of the most interesting parts of economic models, or where I used to spend a lot of my time as a quant, was trying to explain the assumptions of economic models to management. So the idea is you could use some maybe option pricing model and you get some output, and management tends to say, okay, well, that's the answer, right? And it was my job to qualify that quite a bit to say, okay, if complete markets holds, if our assumptions on volatility holds, and so forth. So to give a framework that within which that answer is correct, right? And again, this is important because management will tend and management people in general will tend to overlook the assumptions and then just focus on the answer and think that this is the answer, right? This is it. But economic models are always simplifications of reality. So the answer always exists in a world that is more simple than the world in which we live, right? That's true of all economic models. And that is an extremely important point that is it's not mentioned enough, because often people selling the answers to economic models don't want to point that out. It's also just kind of harder to understand models in the framework of how they relate to the real world. People just want simplicity. So speaking simply about tariffs, I'm going to talk about two assumptions on tariffs, right? Two assumptions are perfect competition, and I'm going to talk about sort of frictions in the labor market. So what is perfect competition? If I were to say, well, tariffs are going to raise prices, and most people won't look at the assumptions, but if they do look at the assumptions and I say perfect competition, this will generally be viewed as, well, it's innocuous, right? Oh, well, it's some academic thing, it's probably fine. When in reality, the important implication of this perfect competition assumption is that there's no profit margin for firms. No profit margin. Right? So what this means is obviously the firms are price takers, and they're going to price stuff at cost, right? So if a tariff raises the cost, then by definition it's going to raise prices for consumers, right? So this assumption is not small, it's not innocuous. In fact, this assumption makes it makes tariffs, it makes the conclusion that tariff raised prices. Does that make sense? So now, again, perfect competition sounds fine. If you were to say, well, the perfect competition is going to imply no profit margin. If you were to tell people, oh, my assumption of the model is that firms have no profit margin. Well, now they would look at that assumption and go, well, that's maybe not a great assumption because firms have positive profit margins. So what does this mean for tariffs? Well, what this means is let's say we go back to when we were arguing whether we should drop tariffs, decades ago. Well, if you argue perfect competition, then dropping tariffs means a drop in prices. Well, in reality, what often happened was that the firms didn't actually drop the prices. They just their cost dropped. They sold it for the same amount, and they earned a massive. They earned that profit margin, right? So the idea here is, on the flip side, when we raise tariffs, firms might not be able to raise their prices. They might just eat the cost in terms of lower profit margins. So the idea is what tariffs could do is, prices may stay the same. When you drop tariffs, it just increases firm profit margins. And when you raise tariffs, it just, collapses firm profit margins. Of course, now you can see why companies, right, companies making the phone I'm recording on, are very interested in not having tariffs, right? Because it is going to affect their profit margin, right? Or I should say, their profit margin will be affected if they cannot simply transfer the increased cost to consumers, right? This is also why whenever the tariffs come up in the news media will go and they'll ask a company and say, well, are you going to pass this cost along? And of course they're going to say, yes, I'm going to pass this cost along, because they really don't want tariffs. They're never going to say, well, I'm going to eat profit margin, right? They want to make it, because if a company were to say, well, we'll just have smaller profit margins, people might be in favor of that tariff at that point, right? So they're always going to say, no, we're going to pass the cost on to the consumer. Whether they can is not clear, right? So the idea here is once we, perfect competition is a very bad assumption. When we're dealing with this in the real world, we have to look at the level of competition in this particular market and whether tariffs, this level of, if it's there's a lot of competition in the market. If there's narrow profit margins, then yes, it's likely that the cost will be transferred to the consumer. But if there's wide profit margins, not a lot of competition, in different markets, that cost might not be transferred, right? So whether the cost is transferred is dictated by the nature of the market. Much harder sort of calculation. It's much less clear whether tariffs will increase prices. The other assumption is that, and this is an assumption that is, I'll go back to Michael Bloomberg saying you can't teach a coal miner to code. One of the economic assumptions that underline all these sort of Econ 101 models of tariffs is that if people are fired, they lose their job because of the tariff, they'll just find another job, right? Well, that's a very bad assumption, right? So what the Econ 101 models don't assume, right, is that, if somebody is unemployed because of a tariff, well, then they can't find a new job, they go on unemployment, which is a cost to people. You pay unemployment in your taxes, so it's a cost to the rest of the community. Maybe they can't find a job, they can't pay their house taxes, their house becomes dilapidated, right? So property values go down in a particular area where a lot of people are laid off. So none of these costs are included in your typical tariff Econ 101 calculation, right? So conversely, right, if we raise tariffs, right, well, maybe, I might have to pay more, maybe for something, but maybe other people in my community are employed and they pay more taxes and the parks become nicer and there's all these externalities. So when you include that benefit to the community of potential benefit to the community of raising taxes, well, that may more than offset any cost increase on something I'm buying. So to conclude here, right, the idea is whenever you see something like tariffs raise prices, right, or any output of any sort of economic model or analysis, the first thing you should do is say, what are your assumptions? Right? What are the assumptions that are going into the model? Because when you make make these assumptions, then the economic analysis becomes very simplistic and the assumptions force tariffs to increase costs. There's really no analysis after that. The analysis, these will force tariffs to increase costs. So what you should always do is, one, consider that economic models are always simplifications of reality, so the output is always going to be a simplification, right? And two, that the assumptions can have a massive impact on the output. So you need to understand the assumptions. And if the assumptions do not make sense, if you're dealing with the Black-Scholes model and volatility is constant, well then maybe that model output doesn't make sense, right? And if you're dealing with models of tariffs and the assumption is no profit margin, maybe the output of that model doesn't make sense. But the idea is always jump immediately to understanding the assumptions of any economic model. Have a great day.